Patricia was recruited at 19, I believe.
And
Right.
Pat Krenwinkel is she's a violence survivor who engaged in unspeakable violence with other members of the so-called Manson family over 2 nights in August of 1969. These crimes, they shocked the nation in their brutality and their senselessness. But despite the horrors of those crimes, really her complete rehabilitation from those unspeakable acts is undeniable. And
Yeah.
I'm glad we get a chance to talk a bit about her case.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with a very special live stream to multiple platforms. It's Monday, October 6th, and I am very happy to do this live stream with a distinguished guest. It's a very timely topic, I believe, and I think because everyone who's tuning in knows my work is with undue influence, cults, brainwashing, mind control, and how to help people get out of it. I think you'll be particularly interested in the subject matter for today's talk. First, I want to introduce my guest. Keith Wattley is an attorney. He is the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Uncommon Law. He has a distinguished career. I'm not going to read all of the laudatories, but Keith has been really working very hard for justice to deal with the parole system and how dysfunctional it has been, and to advocate for people who in this case, we're going to be talking about preview Manson cult member Patricia Krenwinkel. We're going to be talking about her case, and that the parole board has recommended her release. But I just wanted to talk about, for me, before I get too deep into Keith Wattley and the work of his organization, that I really want people to understand a lot of folks are not bad people from birth. They get deceived, they get indoctrinated, they get manipulated, and they get into undue influence situations and then commit crimes. And when people ask me, are they guilty for doing the crime? I say yes. If they committed the crime, yes, they're guilty. But then the question is, are they a danger? What is an appropriate compensation for sending a message? That's part of the purpose of the justice system, is to send a message that doing this is not okay, that society will exact a toll. And I just want to say a couple more things, Keith, and then we'll get into more about your project and how it formed and things. I just want to say, many people listening to this know I was recruited into the Moonies cult as a 19-year-old. Patricia was recruited at 19, I believe, and I got radicalized. I became a right-wing fascist. I thought Moon was the Messiah and that everyone who was against Moon was Satan. And I was so indoctrinated. I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night. I was isolated from family and friends. And I've created this whole BITE model of authoritarian control, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control to create a pseudo-identity that's dependent and obedient. And Keith, I was willing to kill on command. I was trained to kill on command or die on command. And before I turn it over to you, I'll just say I was literally made into a leader. Not that I had any power as an American, because the leadership were Koreans and Japanese. But I was in a leadership meeting with Sun Myung Moon where he said, we're going to infiltrate the government. God thinks democracy is satanic. He wants a theocracy. And later he said, when we take power in America, we will amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people who have sex outside of the Unification Church mass weddings. And we'd be doing people a favor if they couldn't stop themselves from sinning by taking their physical bodies away and sending them to the spirit world, and we could save them later. And as a brainwashed Moonie, I thought this was logical and a wonderful idea. So when people think about the Manson cult members, I want people to keep in mind I came from a normal family. I was not I was an introvert, and this was the farthest thing possible. And just by the luck and grace, I got deprogrammed, and here I am 49 years later. So that's my introduction to this conversation. And I'm hoping to invite people to remember values. We're living in a time in the US of lawlessness from the top of our government. And Governor Newsom and others are trying to remind, hey, we have a justice system. It's supposed to work with checks and balances on power, etc. But we're really hoping for Governor Newsom to understand we've had millions of people radicalized to believe that Trump won the 2020 election when all facts say the other way, and that this may be a positive message for him and for those who oppose Trump to educate people who have been unduly influenced. So with that, Keith Wattley, I'm very honored to meet you. You got your law degree from Santa Clara University, and who I know taught there, submitted a statement, an expert witness statement, along with Yanya Lalich for Patricia Krenwinkel. So I'm turning the mic over to you, my friend. Please share.
Well, I will. Thank you for having me, Stephen. This is a great opportunity. And so Professor Shefflin was my professor at law school. I actually had a class with him on legal ethics and learned about him and his work. He didn't talk a lot about his work until you asked him a question, and then he talked a lot about his work. And fortunately, he got a few opportunities to do that while we were in class. So when I was looking for someone to help the parole board understand Patricia Krenwinkel's journey, he was the first person I thought of, and I reached out, and he was very eager to help and spent a lot of time developing a declaration that we then used to help contextualize a lot of the things the parole board had heard about her and a lot of the misunderstandings they had about her life, motivations, and how she changed since then. And I'm glad we get a chance to talk about that. Earlier, we're saying, you want to hear about our work. I can describe our work, but one thing that I found is helpful is to kind of look at it through the lens of like one particular client's case and journey to get a sense of how we approach our work, even before I get to Patricia Krenwinkel's case. And
yes, please.
One thing I like to talk about is this one client. I'll call him Donald. And he was somebody who, as a kid, Donald, he would act out in different ways to get his mother's attention. He was competing with a mix of quite a few siblings, and she had multiple jobs and didn't seem to have a lot of time to be available. But his main method was to throw a tantrum, which often got a response, even if it wasn't the one that he wanted. So this approach followed him into kindergarten. He got kicked out of kindergarten for being too disruptive. By the time he was 7, he'd already been labeled as a problem child. And one day, still when he was about 7, he and some friends were, they were near the home of an older woman in the neighborhood. She'd always been nice to them. She taught some of them how to bake, and she allowed them to search her basement for a baseball and bat. They wanted these things to play with. And so they went down there, but the light on the basement didn't work. So they used lighters and matches to look around down there. At this point, you could probably, imagine where this is going. One of the kids accidentally started a fire that they couldn't put out. So they all ran upstairs and they're yelling, fire, fire. And they succeeded in getting the woman out of the house. And Donald's house was just a few doors down. So he goes running to tell his mother what happened. Unfortunately, after the kids had gotten the woman out of the house, she went back inside to save her cat, and she didn't make it back out again. So since Donald had been seen running from the house, he was ultimately held responsible for arson and murder. And remember, he's only 7.
Yeah.
So he spent the next 8 years or so locked up in different institutions, juvenile detention, camps, mental hospitals. And in those spaces, some of those spaces, any outburst would be met with both physical violence and heavy doses of Thorazine and other drugs at that
Yeah.
time. So at one point, he was beaten so bad he was left in a coma for multiple days. So he was released when he was 15 years old from that setting. He couldn't read, couldn't write. He was depressed, and he was addicted to alcohol. And while working an odd job, a friend talked him into burglarizing someone's home. And during the burglary, the friend confronted the homeowner, shot and killed him. Donald's convicted of second-degree murder. So that's 2 deaths that he didn't personally cause. This time he received a sentence of life, 15 years to life. He was 19 years old at this time. So fast forward about 30 years. That's when I first met Donald. I was looking for clients to assign some students at a law school. And we wanted someone who had a parole hearing coming up. And as I said, Donald's sentence was 15 to life. That means once you serve that 15-year minimum, then you become eligible for parole consideration. You appear before a parole board. If they deny you parole, you go back to see them every couple of years or so until they either grant you parole or you die. That's the sentence. And Donald had a pretty clean disciplinary record in prison, and he finally taught himself to read and write. But he also wasn't participating in any really meaningful programs. He was just sort of doing time. In his eyes, the world had basically given up on him. So he really gave up imagining himself ever getting out of prison. He didn't even go to his previous hearing, his parole hearing. He just didn't go. He didn't see any point in it. And then out of the blue, he gets a letter from me saying, "Hey, we're interested in possibly helping you." And so we met him. He was really baffled by the idea that anyone even noticed him, much less cared about him. And he had no one from his family was in touch, had been in touch for years at this point. So we met him. He was really at a point where he felt totally forgotten, and he was kind of like, I don't understand. We ended up working with him for many hours over the next 5 years. And at that time, we're breaking down all the many traumatizing experiences he'd had and understanding how they impacted him. And these were, as you can imagine, difficult conversations. They required a lot of trust, a lot of patience, a lot of compassion. But he was open, he was vulnerable, and he became able to connect the dots in his own life. So from the time we started working with him, it took multiple parole hearings before he was finally released. By then, the students were gone, and it was just the 2 of us. And so we sat outside the hearing room after his last hearing, and he looks over at me with tears in his eyes. Obviously he's elated, he's shocked, he's surprised, but he says, "I really want to thank you. You saved my life." I said, "Donald, I just feel privileged that you were willing to trust me and my team, and you shared enough of your life so we could help you." But before I could get all that out, he's like, "No, you don't understand. You actually saved my life." He said, "I never told you this before, but right before I received your letter 5 years ago, I was about to kill myself. I didn't know why you showed up when you did, but I figured it must be a sign that I should keep going. You really saved my life." And so Donald's free today. That was several years ago. He's been out for a while. He never thought he would be able to get out until he found, someone cares, somebody's willing to spend the time to get to know me and to support me for no reason. So he's just one person, but
Well, there was a reason. You cared as a human being.
For him, he didn't like, "Hey, why me?"
Right. I get it.
It was right.
But it is an act of grace and love, and just you're a good guy to consider investing yourself for no payback in terms of money, but it is very fulfilling. I know as a therapist who's done a lot of pro bono over the years, it's just very fulfilling to help people.
It really is. And to see his journey and to think that he's one of more than 30,000 people in California serving life sentences. That's in California out of about 200,000 nationwide. And nearly all of them are survivors of violence long before they hurt anyone else. And this is especially true among women, with up to 95% or more having experienced physical, sexual, emotional abuse before they came to prison. And, these stories really helped me understand just the power of transformation and just how easily people can fall into, really tragic, terrible circumstances. And it has me conclude that just about everyone is capable of extreme violence under the worst circumstances. And just about everyone is capable of transformation under the best circumstances. I've seen both of those things play out. And
Right.
Pat Krenwinkel she's a violence survivor who engaged in unspeakable violence with other members of the so-called Manson family over 2 nights in August of 1969. These crimes, they shocked the nation in their brutality and their senselessness. But despite the horrors of those crimes, really her complete rehabilitation from those unspeakable acts is undeniable. And
Yeah.
I'm glad we get a chance to talk a bit about her case.
Yes, please. But tell us how you came to form Uncommon Law, and then we'll get into her case.
Sure.
I
Well,
really am. I think it's great. I'd never heard of it. And that's why I said, let's do a live stream and tell the world, because I have an audience around the world. They should know about what you do.
yeah. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work. I founded it in 2006. So we've been at it almost 20 years. And when I founded Uncommon Law, I was already an attorney working with people in prison. My focus was really on mental health care for people who needed it inside, which is a significant percentage of our prison population. Medical care, excessive force by prison guards, things like that. And got a letter in the mail from someone who was serving a life sentence. And he had
So you got
been,
a letter
yeah,
out of the
yeah.
blue.
But this was a letter, that I was working at a place that got, at that time, 100 letters a day, maybe,
Oh.
from all people who were incarcerated, most of them in California state prisons.
Hmm.
But we didn't often at the time get letters from people serving life sentences about their life sentences. A lot of other kind of prison conditions issues would come up. And this particular letter talked about how he'd been granted parole by the parole board.
Hmm.
And then got another letter a few months later from the parole board saying, we're thinking about changing our mind, taking away that parole grant we gave you.
Mm.
I need help. And so I said, well, this is interesting. Let me learn more about this. He must have gotten a rule violation or something
Mm.
like that. And none of that. It was just, that was a policy and practice at the time of revisiting parole grants with the intention of reversing them. And often it was at the request of the governor, who in California has had this authority since about 1989 to um, take really aggressive direct action to reverse a parole grant. For
Mm.
even before that, the governor could refer a case back to the board for further consideration. But as of 1989, the governor could, nope, I disagree, go back. And this person had a case where his hearing was referred for a full review. They ordered a rescission hearing to consider taking away his parole grant. So I
Yeah.
helped him with that and saw him come home and he was able to keep his parole grant. He finished college soon after that, got a good job, family, all that stuff. And I said, this is a powerful way to experience how my work as an attorney, as an advocate, manifests itself in the life of someone who now gets to write his next chapter
Mm.
by himself. And it was really, really fulfilling work. The other prison conditions work I had been doing was fulfilling in a very different way, much slower pace.
Hmm.
And as I was working with him, I met other people serving life sentences. And even though I was an attorney doing this work in prisons, working with people in prison, I didn't know much about life sentences. And most of the other attorneys and advocates I encountered didn't either. And there was almost no one I could call to learn how to do it effectively. I hadn't seen a parole hearing before I represented him in my first
Wow.
one. And there was no real pipeline to learn how to do this kind of work. And I realized, well, these are folks who don't really have an advocate. I think I want to do that. And so I started to take
Mm.
on more cases. And as I got into the cases, I realized that the parole board is trying to answer these questions about why someone committed the crime they committed. And it's not a question of whether they did it. That those arguments had already been lost at the
Right.
trial level and appellate level. Now it's about, how do we understand why you did it so that we're satisfied that you would never do it again.
Right.
Now, our work really is about helping people understand all the different factors that led to their crime. So that comes through our what we call trauma-informed counseling, legal representation of people who are appearing before the parole board. And we also created a program that's developing spaces inside the prisons so that incarcerated people can mutually support each other in processing their own trauma histories and answering these difficult questions so they can create a new life for themselves. And so it's a really critical gap that we're filling with respect to the available programming within prisons. And so our clients are 2 to 3 times more likely to be granted parole than the state average. We've now seen about 350 of our life sentenced clients come home, and the recidivism rate is 1%.
That's great.
And so I realized in doing this work that these difficult questions about why you did something, with very few exceptions, involved analyzing someone's childhood and adolescent trauma and trying to understand the kind of decisions you made from those experiences and how it showed up in causing harm to someone else. And in doing that, I realized that I had turned into the counselor that my own sister never had when she was in prison for most of about 30 years. And
is that part of your story? Of
that's
how
a big
you
part
got
of it. But what's interesting though is it was not a conscious part of it. I wasn't intentionally seeking out this kind of work to help her, but I realized, oh, you know, this is an interesting pattern here. I'm talking to people about their experiences and how they ended up in prison, and most of the time they can identify some key moments in their lives in which something happened to them. They made up a story about it that then led them down a path that landed them in prison. And so I started doing that same work with my sister while she was still incarcerated at that time. And we got to the bottom of a lot of things that were happening with her. And I just felt like this is what I'm supposed to do. And so I started Uncommon Law to both do this work full time, but also to develop some pipelines for other attorneys and advocates to learn about, to engage this process, to change it, to improve it, to give people a fair chance to come home. So we've grown to now we have 35 staff members. I have 10 other lawyers who work here, I have therapists on staff. I have a bunch of people who've come home from life sentences and who work on our team to help bring others home. So that's Uncommon Law.
Impressive. I'm so happy to know you. And I just want to say, I think the U.S. is the highest country in the world for incarceration. And was it Finland that they put people in jail to help them rehabilitate? Like they don't believe in life. Am I remembering the country?
The country that a lot of time gets the credit nowadays is Norway, really.
Norway.
As having a model for rehabilitation within its prisons that should be replicated in other places. It's not quite as straightforward as that, I think, for a number of reasons that we could talk about. But I do think the idea of treating people who are incarcerated as people who are going to be coming home is an important place to start. And we don't do that enough here in our prisons, especially when we're talking about people who are going away for life. You know, you got a life sentence, we will never see you again. California has developed a process that holds out the possibility that someone gets to come home. When they can show the parole board they're no longer dangerous, they're supposed to come home. That's the way the law is supposed to work.
Yeah, California is way ahead of any other state that I'm aware of in terms of researching undue influence. And I know they have a unique program for elders who get unduly influenced by caregivers and give over their money and other things. They have a whole system to train caregivers to protect elderly because this notion of undue influence is recognized as a real thing. We can be socially influenced to do really bad things, including things against ourselves that hurt ourselves and hurt others.
Well, the other thing that's happened in California is we have officially recognized that the fact that someone committed serious violence isn't the end of their story. It's really not even the beginning of their story, but that understanding why someone did it and recognizing people do certain things at a young age that they would never do when they get older. People who are much older, much less likely to commit any kind of crime, much less violence, and that people who are survivors of intimate partner battering are supposed to be given special consideration. Really great weight should be paid to the fact that someone survived harm long before they caused it, especially if the harm they experienced directly contributed to their actions in harming someone else. So, and this is even those three pieces: youth parole, we call it, elderly parole, and recognizing intimate partner violence. Those are just three factors that have been added to our statutory scheme to make sure that people being considered for parole get a fair chance.
Right.
And I can talk about how those developed in a minute if you'd like.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think we want to make sure that we cover the Manson cult and what was done to Patricia that was the criteria of how the violence. I think that's part of the piece of what you want to cover. But you
It
lead
is.
me.
Okay. Well, I'll get us right to that.
Okay.
But I think some context makes a lot of sense because of the timing of all these things.
Great.
Back in 1975, the California Supreme Court actually struck down the state's parole process as being unconstitutionally biased. The parole board was denying release to anyone they didn't like or whose crimes they found were particularly heinous. So the state had to come up with a new system to make the process less subjective, really.
Okay.
But remember, this was 1975.
Right.
And these Manson-related crimes, as I said, happened in 1969.
Right.
Now, Pat and the others received sentences of 7 years to life. 7 years to life. That meant that at the same time the state was trying to implement uniform and predictable sentencing rules, these folks were about to become eligible for parole consideration. And again, so these were people they didn't like and whose crimes were abhorrent, right? So in the 5 decades since then, the state legislature has instituted numerous reforms to override the prejudice that was inherent in this system to try to ensure fairness. So among the things they did was they passed a law that mandated that parole must be granted once the person no longer is a risk to public safety. You have to do it. And that denying someone parole has to be the exception to the rule that parole should normally be granted. They also passed laws saying that survivors of intimate partner violence were supposed to be more likely to be granted parole. People who were young at the time of the crime were supposed to be more likely to be granted parole. People who are elderly and have therefore aged out of crime were supposed to be more likely to be granted parole. And again, these changes were all intended to overcome inherent bias in decision making. Yet, despite these changes, the parole board's parole granting rate has been below 20% for nearly all of the past 50 years. Now, Pat falls within the categories of being a domestic violence survivor. She was young at the time of these crimes. She's elderly now and much less likely to commit any crime. She's had about 17 different parole hearings over the past 45 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the board's most recent hearing in May of this year, that decision was the second time in a row that a panel of commissioners found she no longer presents a risk to public safety. Now, the evidence they considered it involved their own evaluators who had previously established that Pat was directly under the influence and control of Charles Manson, who controlled his followers with threats, with violence, with drugs, with all mental games and coercion. And those evaluators also understood that Pat willingly accepted Manson's authority from the beginning because he offered an identity, he offered guidance, and it was coupled with this illusion of love and acceptance, all of which she had been seeking as a confused 19-year-old. And the parole board's records also, they already showed her explanation that in order to please Manson, she was willing to embrace his philosophy about the need to use violence to foment a race war, that she actively promoted the philosophy among others in the group, and that she actively attacked the victims in these cases.
Mm-hmm.
And we also had they put together a special report on intimate partner violence and confirmed, yes, she was a survivor. Yes, she experienced it. Yes, that happened. And Professor Shefflin, in his declaration, he recounted the role of her own psychological mental predisposition, the role of drugs, the role of Manson's unique form of mind control, the role of the dynamics of culture and of Pat's recovery from it. All those things were well documented in his declaration. So the parole board had this information in front of them. They also had their own psychologist who have observed that since she came to prison now 56 years ago, Pat has found her own identity, her independence, her moral compass, such that she's at the lowest possible risk of future violence. Those psychologists have written 9 different reports finding her to be a low risk over the past 40 years. So a person who has never had a rule violation in prison, by the way, who's actively participated in scores of relevant programs, enhance her education, obtain excessive vocational skills and dog training in other areas, the law overwhelmingly favored this second parole grant. So she's in a position now where the governor gets to weigh in on this parole decision, and he has 3 different options. He can affirm the parole grant, take no action on it, let it go, and then she gets released. Or he could reverse it outright, say, no, I disagree, you're unsuitable for these reasons.
How would he know? It's got to be political for anybody to say.
Yeah.
It's.
There's
sorry to interrupt you, but no, how could a governor make a decision like that without looking at all the reports and?
Not only that, by looking at the reports and deciding, no, I think differently. Like it just doesn't make any sense. So he could do that. He could directly reverse it. But the third option is the governor could refer the case back to the board. So this was a panel of commissioners from the board who made this decision. Once that decision became final, it came to the governor's office. This third option allows him to send it back to the board for them to have the full board or a much larger panel of commissioners weigh in on the case. Say, did we get this right or did we get this wrong? And that's actually the option that I'm urging that the governor to take. If he has any concerns, any questions about whether the parole board considered everything they were supposed to, ask them to take a look with the full board. And that's what we're urging anyone interested to support Pat's potential release to do.
I'll write something.
Great. Well, to do that, you go to, there's a portal on the governor's website. It's gov.ca.gov. And you click contact, and then there's a drop-down menu, and you choose parole governor's review. And it allows you to share your opinion. And you have to include Pat's name. It's Patricia Krenwinkel, and her prison number, which is W0.
Right. So we're going to add all this info to the recording for those, or contact freedom of mind or uncommon law, and you will get all of the details, and maybe we'll even get a model letter of the kinds of things you could say potentially.
Yeah, that would be great. But just to make sure people got it, gov.ca.gov. There you go. And yeah, we'll be able to share that. And this is because of the sensational and high profile nature of this case. A lot of people are interested in weighing in. Pretty much all of those people who have been weighing in over the years don't know anything about what Pat has been doing for the last 56 years. They focused on the crime, the impact on the victims and their families. And so there have been petitions that get signed, and they have thousands of names of people who never met her and don't know much about the case beyond the facts from 1969. But we have a parole process that requires the parole board's decisions and the governor's decisions to be based on current evidence of dangerousness. And the evidence is what I just laid out, what their own psychologists have concluded, and what's really solid in the record.
And she's 80 years old or something?
Almost. She'll be 78 in December.
Okay. So I'm going to throw a thing in here from left field, but it's something if, in fact, the governor wants more investigation to look into it. But I've been helping people out of Scientology for 40 plus years. And one of my friends and colleagues is the world's authority on Scientology, John Atack, Jonatack. And when I first met ex-Scientologists and they showed me their training routines, and I'm mentioning it just because there's now documented evidence Charlie Manson had 150 hours of Scientology processing himself. And when I looked at some of the initial training routines as someone trained in hypnosis, and I'll just circle back, if you don't mind, to your teacher, Alan Shefflin, because the two of us wrote 2 chapters in a clinical textbook on hypnosis, on the dark side of hypnosis. It was an area of his expertise and mine. And Charlie Manson was taught to do the eyeball staring stuff. That's part of the programming of Scientology. And they have people go back in their past traumas, and he remembered he was Jesus in a past life. And this whole untold angle to the Manson story after all these decades. And John's done a number of videos. I know he has a book that he's working on about it. But I just want all of my listeners who are former members who have experienced undue influence to really take a few minutes to go to the portal and share your story, because I'd love the governor and for everyone else to see. There are a lot of us who were raised in authoritarian cults or recruited and left, and we can say, yep, it happened to us, and we're normal, healthy people. Many of us have gone on to have very successful careers. So forgive me, Keith.
No, that's all right.
A curveball.
Well, it's a really important bit of information, especially when you think about, sometimes people will act in a really intense and focused way for a relatively short period of time. I mean, I don't know how long you were involved, but
2.5 years, but I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, working 7 days a week. And I got to be, as I said in the beginning, Moon wanted to destroy the United States and our system of government and our separation of church and state. And I was like, yes. And he literally said, we're going to murder people if they don't do what we want. And I was like, yes. We'll be doing it to help them by taking their bodies away, because I was so not in my conscience and my critical faculties.
Right. Well, and it's in the parole context. It's really important to keep in mind that these crimes that Pat committed occurred during a discrete 2-year period in her life. 2 years between ages 19 and 21. Out of almost 78. There you go. Something magical about that.
Well, we're vulnerable then, because we're still figuring out our identities. It's that's like, right. Who am I? Where do I fit in the world?
Right.
Sorry, keep going, buddy.
But that's right. But when asking the question, well, what is the likelihood that I'll fall back into that pattern?
0.
That's one of exactly. Well, that's the question the parole board is supposed to be asking, right? And so they occur within, the context of extreme physical, emotional, psychological, social violence and control. And it's like the distinct behavior, personality, influence of Charles Manson for sure. And it's such a highly unique, combination of factors that you have to acknowledge. That's hardly ever, ever likely to happen again. Certainly never for her. But you could point to her own full acceptance. At the time, her acceptance of the philosophy, her willingness to participate in these violent acts. Yes, I'm all in. Followed by a well-documented break from that historical thinking, those historical behavior patterns, really beginning early on in her incarceration. It's exactly the evidence that the parole board is supposed to consider, and that shows that she's a decreased risk. There's this other thing you kind of alluded to this earlier. You didn't mention Donald Trump, but I will, because one of the most
I have a book up over my shoulder.
I know that you've written about him a few years ago in the cult of Trump. But one of the most insulting things one of the most insulting things about him is that he counts on people being too stupid to believe the things that are right in front of their eyes. And I think Governor Newsom would make that same mistake if he pretends that his decision, if he wants to block Pat's parole, is based on anything other than politics. Anything else he has to say is complete nonsense. And anyone who's an objective observer of this case will see it exactly for what it is. He should not make the mistake that he can tell people, oh, it's because she lacks insight into why she did it. She's got more insight than just about anybody I've ever encountered And I've worked with thousands of people inside dealing with
And
these
I've
these
worked with
issues.
thousands of
And you
people
know,
over 49 years
yeah.
as a survivor.
So you know, and you know what's perhaps the most shocking disconnect is that on paper, California says it wants to be different. We don't want to be given into hate and anger and have those emotions drive our decision making. Um, and we've changed our laws, as I said. We've even named our prison system to emphasize rehabilitation. Yet the potential for bias persists in our release decisions. And
Yeah.
we need the governor to hold true to what the law actually requires in this case.
Yes, if I may, for me, the messaging that, because I follow Gavin Newsom and his social media posts, and he's like, this is a 5 alarm fire, and they're
Yes.
militarizing, etc. He could do a messaging saying, I know the Trump propaganda machine is going to say that I'm against, I'm for criminals and helping criminals. But let's be honest, people. Let's look at the behaviors, not hear the words, and let's
Yeah.
really think with our critical thoughts and our hearts, because in the end, we have ourselves, we have our communities, we have the belief that essentially most people are good. They're not evil, they're not out to harm, and people can be unduly influenced to believe and follow very unethical, predatory, malignant narcissists like Donald Trump and Charles Manson. And welcome if you're starting to wake up and
Mm.
realize he's not for black people, black people for Trump and Hispanics for Trump and gays for Trump. He's not for any of the. This was
Right.
all a psychological warfare. So part of my appeal is to really think about it as a messaging opportunity to bring back values that
Yeah.
make us human.
That's right. And you know, this is an important opportunity for Governor Newsom to be on the right side of this. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And some leading survivor groups are among those urging Governor Newsom to uphold Pat's parole grant. There's this organization called the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, and there's another one that's a national anti-violence organization called Valor, and they're committed to advancing equity and ending sexual violence in particular. And Valor wrote a letter to the governor. And in their letter, they say, as an organization that advocates for survivors of violence, including incarcerated survivors of gender based violence, we
Mm.
believe Ms. Krenwinkel's case exemplifies the need for a trauma informed and legally consistent approach to parole decisions. So during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, these organizations and many others are demanding results that are trauma informed and consistent with the law. And I've just laid out what the law is, which is about deciding whether someone's currently dangerous or not. And when the parole board makes this decision, their focus has to be, by law, on current evidence. It's not on what happened 56 years ago, unless there's something current that makes that 56-year-old crime and
Sure.
set of actions to be relevant and predictive of someone's future behavior. And all the evidence in this record shows that it's not in Pat's case.
Yep. Yeah, and again, it's a matter of the people walk around, Keith, with what's known as the fundamental attribution error. It's one of the big principles of social psychology. I saw you nodding, so I know
Yes.
you know what I'm talking about. People have this unconscious bias when they look and try to understand human behavior to over attribute personality or
Right.
disposition and underestimate environment or influences in the environment. And we are not an island. We are not rational. Humans are social and emotional beings who rationalize and think. And just every person needs to understand that it can happen to you under the right set of circumstances. Something really horrible could happen. And it's not, and really the law is, I understand that it's to send a message to everyone else, don't do this ever again because there'll be consequences. And I wish that happened to Donald Trump for all of his illegal crimes that he, was never allowed to run again. and his violent coup. But the point is, and then what you're emphasizing is the person is not a danger to society anymore, and that we have this belief of redemption, that people can change and grow and become contributing members of society.
That's right. And there's some states that really don't care about that part. Like officially, they don't
Yeah.
pretend that they care about redemption, rehabilitation, transformation, any of that. California does. We
Yeah.
officially say we do care about that. But the fact that the governor has a role in this process politicizes it in a way that is really harmful, really detrimental to folks who are going through the process. In fact, there's a one state in Maryland, the state of Maryland, a couple of years ago, removed the governor from their parole review process, and their parole grant rate has gone up since then.
Interesting.
Still,
Well, I'm a
people
fan of
safely being
Jamie
released.
Raskin, and he's a constitutional law professor who's a congressman who was on the January 6th committee, and he's from Maryland. So
Yeah.
it's really, we really need to reform, reform, reform. And in the meantime, we're under assault for such heinous attacks on human rights and of all citizenry.
No, that's
So,
that's right. One of the things that I want to make sure that we get to talk about by the time is flying. I don't know how
yeah,
that's
we
happened.
have ten minutes or so.
Is I meet with Pat regularly. I just saw her last week, and to see someone who's done all they can do, who's accepted full responsibility for what they've done, and spent their last now 56 years in prison trying to make amends, trying to help other people, trying to help other people understand how she got into this and how they can interrupt their own cycles of violence in their own lives. To see someone do that, but also feel like, well, mine is a different case because politics control, because we have a governor who may have different, political aspirations after he's governor and
Mm,
doesn't want to take a risk. She's not overly optimistic, but I do remind her what the law is. And
right.
the law requires that she be given a chance because she's no longer dangerous. And she's developed concrete, realistic parole plans. They include transitional housing in the community, and followed by stable housing with family members in another state. It involves substance use treatment, it involves counseling, other pro-social support. And she's got what we sometimes refer to as relapse prevention plans that identify the kind of factors in the past that contributed to her being involved in problematic relationships and behaviors, and how she will interrupt those things going forward.
Mm,
Practices she's been using for the last 50 plus years. And so the process really requires that she's done this work to prepare herself for release,
sure.
even if the politics are in the way of that right now. At least they have been up to now, because this is the second parole grant she's gotten.
Right.
The governor reversed her last one. And this time around, we were able to show how what he said before were missed some things, really important pieces
Hmm.
from the file. We presented extensive evidence that's already in the prison files that
Right.
somehow maybe the governor wasn't aware of, to show how she's done all the things that she could do. And I've represented thousands of people serving life sentences, and I've seen them complete those sentences in many ways. In the best scenarios, they come home, they rejoin their
Hmm.
families, and live a positive life outside of prison. But I've also had clients complete their sentences by having a heart attack just before we got to the parole board. I've had clients stabbed to death, beaten to death in prison. But death by politics is especially tragic. And we cannot sit by and let that happen to Pat.
Yeah. I agree. I wanted to also just say I interviewed a man named Ramadan Shabazz who went to Vietnam, was drafted, was in the bus arriving in Vietnam. Somebody seated near him in the bus got assassinated by a sniper's bullet in front of him. Got addicted to heroin. When he came back, went to the VA. He was traumatized. He had PTSD. He was traumatized, addicted. The VA didn't help him. Got involved with a robbery, committed a murder, was sentenced to capital punishment. That was abolished in Massachusetts. But the long story short is 51 years He finally had the governor commute the sentence. He married his childhood sweetheart. I got to go to his wedding. And, sitting with him, I treated him to Indian food. And he was in heaven to be in a restaurant, just enjoying a meal, like a real
Yeah.
meal. And he talked about going out to the ocean for the first time in all those decades and just feeling the wind and smelling the water. And just his description to me changed my life, just to be with him
Yeah.
experiencing this. And then lastly, I was invited by Jordan Harbinger, who's a very prominent podcaster, for his 40th birthday. He said, come join me at a Supermax prison in California. There's a program that gives incarcerated people college credit, and you can help teach them how to answer questions, etc. But it was the first time I was ever in a prison
Mm.
and meeting people who had committed murderous crimes. And we were just hanging out as human beings. And again, that was really life-changing for me as a spoiled, privileged white guy from Flushing, Queens, New York, to understand we're in a modern society and we put people in cages like this.
Yeah.
And the
That's
people
exactly
that
right.
I met were harassed by the gangs because they were
Mm.
collaborating with the folks that were trying to help rehabilitate them. It was just mind-blowingly
Yeah.
important for me.
That is one of the things, that you touched on there, which is about the culture within these institutions. It requires people to show up in a way that's the direct opposite of healing and vulnerability and self-introspection. And at the higher security level prisons, it's virtually unheard of that you would acknowledge some of the things you experienced as a kid that
Yeah,
clearly weren't your fault. And so among the things we do at Uncommon Law is try to provide those kind of spaces for
yeah,
people to do that work and mutually support each other through that work. And our program's called Home After Harm. And we're seeing some dramatic differences. We're seeing people who are for the first time getting the chance to understand the impact their actions had on someone else.
right.
Because some of it is like when they allow themselves to revisit their own trauma histories, they realize, wait a minute, I did that to somebody else. Like I caused someone else
Mm,
to experience that. And it brings about a pretty dramatic transformation. And, we don't talk enough, I think, about within the parole process, at least, about the role of survivors, victims, family members. When they come to parole hearings, they are often in a state that's of anger, pain, sadness, that's almost as raw as it was when the crime happened 20 or 30 years
trauma.
ago,
Yeah.
right? Because this process does not offer them an opportunity to heal. Like there are a lot of barriers to healing in the process, frankly, for everyone involved. And when people do have that opportunity, their lives are changed. And when I talked to Pat, she very much wishes for the family members of her victims to have some opportunity to heal from the harm that she caused.
Yeah.
She's not denying that she caused it and
Right.
wishes that she could do something to help with their healing process.
Right. But it's healing. My experience with forgiveness is you can't tell someone to forgive, but it's healing. As a therapist, I'm speaking.
Yeah.
Those people who are able to rise up, step into the perpetrator's shoes, understand the road they walked and how they did come to do that act, especially if their repentance is sincere. It's Yeah, it's life changing. It's healing because they can let go of their trauma too, because the past is
That's right.
done.
That's right. And to be clear, she doesn't seek their forgiveness or feel entitled to it in any way. She just wants them to find some peace, if it's at all possible, after the devastation that she brought to their lives.
Right. I hear you. It's so important. So let's just do one more wrap up about Uncommon Law, the work you do. It's a great effort. So many lawyers, staff, but this is focused for California specifically, Keith.
It is, however, what we've learned, especially with the program I just mentioned, Home After Harm, is that there
Mhm.
are opportunities in other states to transform the prison experience of people who have to go to a discretionary parole board or a governor's review to be released. Because we have parole boards that are saying, you need to show up in our hearings being able to explain why you did what you did and connect all the dots. But we have prisons that don't provide programming to be able to do that, to be able to answer those questions. So Home After Harm is an example of here's how we can close the gap between what's being expected and what's actually being offered. And it makes a huge difference. We're seeing it transform some of the maximum security yards where we have it on right now. I know we're about out of time, but I'd wrap my comments by really emphasizing that we have a reductionist approach to crime and punishment that is, it's reducing each of us to just one thing. Like we can label, and when you do that, it misses all the complexity that makes us human, right? And California has a system that on paper says it wants to consider all that complexity in making its
Right.
release decisions. And under the law and under the facts, there's really only one correct outcome in this case. And as I said, if the governor is at all concerned the parole board may have missed something, failed to consider some relevant and reliably documented evidence in the case, refer the case for the full board to review it and so they can be sure. And again, those who want to weigh in, go to gov.ca.gov, click contact in the drop-down menu, select parole governor's review, enter Patricia Krenwinkel.
Thank you for your good work. So my quest, I'm 71, my quest is to update the legal system to have a more scientific and comprehensive way to understand undue influence. Because the law is 100 years out of date with understanding developmental psychology, neuroscience, social psychology. And so I've created this model, Keith, that looks at behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control, addresses it as a dissociative disorder. It's actually in the DSM-5, 300.15. But I don't want it to be a slippery slope. That's what lawyers always say, or judges. If you're a minor or if you're elderly with dementia, everything else is a slippery slope. For me, it's not slippery. And I even am running a scientific survey where you can fill out a Likert scale and get a number of how authoritarian control the environment is or not.
Oh, interesting.
Free and anonymous. People can just for themselves go, oh, my family. I just talked with someone this morning who said, I did it on my family of origin. It was a 10 out of 10 for authoritarian control, Steve. But I want to write it up. I want it to become law around the world so people can know if they've been brainwashed or not, you know? So that's my life work.
There you go.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Yeah. Thanks for your support.
That's great. So I'm going to ask Cami to help wrap us up, and we'll have a video and we'll add the information of how to contact your company, your nonprofit, and how people can weigh in to help Patricia Krenwinkel, victim of the Manson cult, and hopefully to create an atmosphere where there's more awareness of how many good people have been radicalized to extremes, that they weren't that way before they were subjected to undue influence.
That's right. And for those who want to meet folks who've come home from these sentences, we have a big welcome home celebration on November 1st here in Oakland at the Bridge Yard.
Wow.
Just go to our website, uncommonlaw.org, and you can register. It's called Uncommon Heroes.
Wonderful. I love it. I hope you're going to like videotape some testimonials or something. And
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will.
Maybe do a live stream. Okay. Thanks so much.